Okay, here's a question for you. How does a society go from a time of, well, pretty broad optimism, think back to the start of the Obama years, maybe into what Thomas Chatterton Williams calls an age of certainty, a time marked by really rigid thinking and, frankly, a breakdown in how we talk to each other. That shift, that whole intellectual and cultural journey is what we're diving into today. And just so you know, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. We're powered by Google's NotebookLM, aiming for deeper, more dynamic book summaries.
And we're trying something a bit new here. This is an extended summary, a really in-depth approach to book coverage. So unlike our usual reviews that give a focused analysis, this is more comprehensive. We'll trace the ideas, the key arguments, the real-world impact. Definitely let us know if you find this expanded format helpful. Your feedback, it genuinely helps us figure out what kind of content to create next.
Right. So the book is Summer of Our Discontent, The Age of Certainty and the Demise of Discourse by Thomas Chatterton Williams. It's nonfiction, cultural analysis, social commentary, and it's a really well-researched, quite evocative look at the rapid changes in American discourse over the past decade or so.
The setting is mainly the U.S., but Williams actually lives in France, so he brings in some interesting international comparisons. We're focusing on the years leading up to, and especially that really pivotal summer of 2020. And the context is, well, it's that mix of social media dominance, huge protests, these fast cultural shifts, and just this constant feeling of crisis that was in the air.
Okay, let's unpack this. Williams knows you can't just jump straight into 2020.
Okay.
To really get why things feel so rigid now, he argues we need to understand the history, the sort of groundwork of discontent. He starts by looking back at some major historical events that he thinks foreshadowed this repeating cycle of crisis and maybe disappointment in America.
Yeah, that historical framing is key. Williams basically suggests today's certainty is, in part, a reaction to earlier hopes that didn't quite pan out. He specifically talks about moments like the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy back in the late 60s, and then the disillusionment after Watergate, and of course the big cultural shifts following 9/11. He sees these as like sequential blows that kind of wore down the national spirit.
And that wearing down, that process, it sort of created a space, maybe a vacuum. Williams then traces how that public optimism, which flickered back during the early Obama years, started to erode. And this isn't just about Democrats versus Republicans, it's deeper, a shift in how society thinks about its shared goals. He pins this erosion partly on two big things, the rise of identity politics and, crucially, the emergence of this internet-fueled monoculture.
Right. And connecting that to the bigger picture, Williams seems to say this disappointment led to a kind of intellectual weariness. It made people maybe more open to these very rigid ways of thinking. He talks about a move away from what he calls universalism, that idea that there's common ground where people can work together beyond their group identity. That's maybe the biggest shift he tracks. So the fall from Obama to Trump, as he puts it, isn't just politics. It reflects this broader polarization, fueled by a change in language itself becoming much more tribal.
And tribalism plus speed. Well, that's a volatile mix.
Right.
Williams really gets into how this internet monoculture, where everything, information, reactions, it all moves so fast, it tended to simplify really complex issues. They became these easy-to-grasp, very moralizing narratives, often punitive too. The speed just squeezed out the context, leaving mostly emotional certainty.
And that setup, that intellectual background, leads us right into the narrative's main focus. That watershed moment of 2020. I mean, that year hit America with this double whammy. First, the intense isolation and fear from the COVID lockdowns, right? And then, almost immediately, this massive wave of outrage after George Floyd was murdered.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how Williams frames George Floyd's murder. Obviously, it was a horrific individual tragedy, but the book presents it as more than that, a symbolic event. It had huge national, even international resonance. It sparked the largest protest movement in American history and just fundamentally changed the conversation about race, about justice, about what protest even means in America.
Exactly. And the change wasn't just happening on the streets in Minneapolis, where Floyd died. These cultural shifts were being amplified and spread incredibly quickly through universities, through institutions, and especially through social media. The lockdown just poured gasoline on that fire. Everyone was isolated, glued to screens, right? So these new cultural norms, these new ways of talking, they spread and hardened incredibly fast.
Which brings us right to the heart of Williams' argument, this age of certainty. We really need to grapple with this tension he describes, the tension between certainty and, well, curiosity. Williams argues pretty forcefully that ideological rigidity is pushing out nuance, pushing out open debate. and that this is leading to a decline, he thinks, in core liberal values, replaced by what he calls closed system thinking.
And what seems to worry Williams is how this certainty takes hold. It's
Right.
often not from deep study necessarily, but from a sense of moral urgency, which then makes any questioning, any deviation from the consensus feel like a moral failing itself. He goes into the rise and the consequences of what he terms wokeness and the related phenomena cancel culture, this intense tribalism, these shifting goalposts around free speech and intellectual argument.
And these aren't just abstract ideas he's floating. He uses very specific, real-world examples to show what he means. Like, he discusses controversial incidents. The Jussie Smollett case is one he mentions, where, particular narratives seem to take precedence over the facts as they emerged. He also talks about those online pylons, which act as this incredibly swift, often way out of proportion punishment for people who step outside the lines of acceptable thought. That fear of being targeted, Williams suggests, is a powerful force in maintaining this certainty.
Absolutely. And before we dig deeper into what's at stake there, this feels like a good moment to pause. We really encourage you to check out Mindful Moments. That's our YouTube channel. It offers AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all aimed at inspiring reflection and hopefully rational thought.
Good point. Now, Williams doesn't just keep his focus on the U.S. One of the really valuable parts of the book, I think, is the international angle. He brings in comparisons based on his experiences living in France.
Yes, that contrast is really illuminating. He looks at French secularism, laïcité, and how this American style of identity politics, or wokeism, as it's often called, is viewed and sometimes resisted quite differently in other places. It really underscores this tension between, say, universal Enlightenment ideals about democracy and this resurgence of very specific, often American-rooted identity politics. It shows this isn't just an American debate.
So, thinking about the book itself, how it's put together, Williams uses linked essays. It's a blend, part memoir, part reporting, part deep cultural analysis, and it's written in a very direct first-person style. He's self-aware, he puts himself in the narrative, observing and reacting.
Right, that memoir aspect lets him engage directly with key figures and the whole discourse around race today. He's not just name-dropping Obama or Trump. He gets into critical discussions about writers and thinkers like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones. He really dissects how their important work has shaped these conversations, but also, in his view, maybe sometimes helped to harden the lines of debate.
And the consequences of all this hardening, this shifting discourse, that's where Williams really digs in during the second half of the book. He looks at the actual, tangible conflicts playing out in really important areas, like education, jobs, policing, the media. He details specific challenges and changes happening in those sectors.
And maybe most revealingly, he talks about shifts in artistic creativity, how artists, writers, how they approach their work now, given these new cultural pressures and the chilling effect of potential backlash or self-censorship. When creative people start worrying about outrage and maybe pull their punches, Williams sees that as a pretty clear sign that discourse is genuinely suffering.
And the engine driving so much of this rigidity, it's technology. Williams spends time analyzing social media dynamics, the actual mechanics of how ideas and arguments spread now. It's not just people talking, it's algorithms at work.
Precisely. He points out how algorithms often amplify the most extreme, the most emotionally charged content, pushing it to the biggest audience. And then there's the digital archive, every old tweet, every statement, every viral video. It's all searchable, permanent. And this becomes a tool in cancel culture, turning maybe fleeting comments or technical info into these permanent, sometimes weaponized public records that shape reactions and shift opinions incredibly fast. But importantly, Williams doesn't really offer a neat conclusion. He maps out the events, shows the ideological divides getting deeper, but there's no final resolution presented. It's left open.
So, summing it all up, what's the takeaway? Well, Williams's book is definitely seen as controversial. It's challenging, it makes you think. He's clearly willing to question assumptions on both the left and the right. Now, while reviewers generally praise its intellectual effort, some do mention that at times the constant listing of controversies related to anti-wokeness can feel a bit repetitive.
Yeah, but the core message, the final thematic point, really comes back to this profound transformation in American racial politics after 2020, and what Williams sees as a resulting decline in intellectual courage in public life. The book reads like an urgent call for genuine engagement over just sticking to moral dogma.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty tough question. Considering this intense tension Williams describes, this age of certainty where both sides often feel completely sure they're right, how does a society even begin to reclaim curiosity? How do we get back to nuance when doubting, questioning, even just having a real dialogue is increasingly seen not as necessary, but as weak, or maybe even as a betrayal? Something to think about. For a deeper analysis, click the link on screen for our in-depth book critique. And please, subscribe, share, consider purchasing the book via the link, and keep thinking rationally.
And don't forget to check out the many genre-based audio summaries at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.